Chapter, we are going to explore the drawing and painting tools. We'll take a look at each of the tools so you'll be able to get a hang of all of them. Let's go ahead and take a look. Let's take a look at the Photoshop drawing tools. In this lesson, you'll just need to create a blank Photoshop document to work in. And I'm in the Essentials workspace. I'm going to create a new layer in my Layers panel, and I'm going to rename it Pixels. And I'm going to hide my background layer while I'm working, just so I can see my blank canvas. Now let's go ahead and look at the rectangle tool. When we click on the rectangle tool, you'll see a variety of shapes available underneath that tool that you can draw with. All these tools work in a similar manner, so we're just going to take a look at the rectangle tool for now. On our options bar at the top, you'll see the word shape. When I click on the word shape, you'll see that there's 3 different drawing modes. These are the drawing modes in Photoshop: shape, path, and pixels. The shape drawing mode has changed in this release, so we'll save that one for last. Let's go ahead and select Pixels, and that's the name of their layer. So we're going to draw a sample rectangle in the Pixels drawing mode. When I draw with my rectangle, I just need to click and drag to create my shape, and you'll see here we get a tooltip that pops up to tell us the size of our rectangle. The color is based on the foreground color that has already been selected. So in this case, our rectangle is black. If I want to change the color of my rectangle at this point, I have to change my foreground color first. Let me pick another color, and then I could use my paint bucket tool, and then I could spill the color inside the black area, and that would change the shade or the color of my rectangle. So once I draw my shade, I have a pixel version of it, which means it's a bitmap or a raster image, which depending on my shape or the colors of my shape, when I'm resizing it to make it larger, you could start to see some quality lessen in your shape because of the resizing factor, because it is a bitmap. We can go to Edit, Transform, and then you could actually apply any of these to the rectangle to modify it. For instance, if we select Warp, you'll see the warp grid come up, and by clicking on the various handles and intersections of lines, you can get very creative in modifying your rectangle so that you don't even know that you started with the rectangle. So I can get very creative here in my modification, and when I'm happy with it, I would just press my return key or my enter key, and I could commit to that. And again, I could still change my color by changing my foreground color and then just spilling my paint bucket on that shape. So that's just drawing with pixels. Nothing's changed from any previous version of Photoshop. Very simple, very easy. Okay, let's make a new layer. Let's call this one Path. We're going to try drawing with the Path mode now. And I'm going to get my rectangle again. And now in my menu, I'm going to choose Path. I'm going to draw a rectangle. And you see nothing's happened. This is because we've drawn a working path or a work path. If I click on my Paths panel, which is in the same grouping with my Layers panel, you'll see I have a work path now created inside my Paths panel, and down at the bottom of my Paths panel, I see a variety of options down here. Let me go ahead and change my foreground color so we have something different than the other layer. Again, it doesn't matter what colors you're choosing, we're just playing around here for a little bit. And the first option on the left-hand side will fill my path. So now if I click back on my Layers panel, you can see I have a rectangle on my path layer that's essentially my shape, and it's filled with my blue color. Let's return to our Paths panel. And the next option will create a stroke with our brush. So let me go ahead and change my color to something that'll stand out. Let me get my brush tool. And now let me click on the next option, the next icon, Stroke Path with Brush. And you'll see that it'll take whatever the characteristics were of my brush, using my foreground color, and create a stroke on that path. The next option loads a selection of that path, and what I can do then is under my Edit menu, I can fill my path color or I can add a stroke. And then the next option is actually working with a selection. So it would make a work path. So if I drew a shape, for instance, and I wanted to make a work path from that, that's the icon that I would click. And then we've seen the mask tool before, and then, so this one is actually creating a new path because we're in the Paths panel. And then we have the trash can. So let me remove my selection and We can also, on the panel menu, we can save various paths and we can make new paths. So work path is only there as you're working with it. It does not stay permanently unless you save it. So I'm going to go back to my layers panel, and now we see we have our path layer and we have our pixels layer. So we have two different versions that we have drawn in two different modes with our rectangle. Let's go back to our rectangle tool, and now let's look at the shape option. Okay, the shape option, you'll notice the option panel is much different than it is for either the other two modes, the path mode or the pixels mode. We now have the ability to choose our colors on the options panel. So I can select a fill color on my options panel. I can select a stroke color up here as well. I can change the width of my stroke, and there are various stroke options that I can create. So let's just start with the basic. Let me go ahead and let me click and drag. And when I do that, a new layer is created automatically with this shape mode. When I draw with the pixels mode or the path mode, it does not create a new layer. It will work on the selected layer that I'm working on at that time. So when I work with a shape mode, it automatically creates a new layer. And you'll notice in the layers panel, it's named after the shape that I drew with, and you can see a little thumbnail there telling you that this is a shape. So I can come back up here on my fill menu. You'll see we have some new options available. They, I believe, came out in CS5. We can change it to a transparent fill, so we have no color in the middle, but we've left a stroke. We can obviously fill with a solid color that's selected in our swatches panel here. We can fill with a gradient, and of course we can come in and we can customize our gradient just like we do with the gradient tool. Now we don't see our gradient because our opacity is set to 0. Let's adjust that up to 100%. And then we can also fill with a pattern. You'll notice that we do have this gear icon available on some panels. What that gives us is some other options available for that specific tool. So here we could come in, we could change our view of our patterns, we could look at them by name, we could change the size of the thumbnail. We can also load additional patterns. You can find additional patterns on the Adobe Exchange. You can find them on many different websites. You just need to do a search for Photoshop patterns. And then you can load them here as well. You can also save patterns and create your own. Now on the strokes, we have the same options, which is kind of neat. We can turn off our stroke. We can make a solid color stroke. We can make a gradient stroke, which is new. So you can actually do some really creative things in Photoshop now. They're trying to bring more features from vector drawing programs and make them inside Photoshop to make it easier so you don't have to go outside of Photoshop to add these kind of items to your drawings or your artwork. And then we can also add a pattern to our stroke. Let me go back and change my fill to a color. There we go. So stroke, again, same thing that you can do with your fill. You can make it transparent, you can make it a solid color, you can make it a gradient, or you can make it a pattern. And we've already seen the width. Under the stroke options panel, we can select different styles of our stroke. That's the style of the line. We can also change the alignment of our stroke, which is similar to the alignment that we used in our styles panel when we're adding layer styles. So we can change the location. Here it would be on the center, here it would be on the outside, and this is on the inside. You can also change the caps to the default, or we can change them to rounded or rectangular, squared edges. And you can also change your corners to rounded edges or where it's diagonally cut. And we don't see this option here because of what we have selected. You can also modify and create your own stroke. So you can create different types of dashes or gaps, and you can also modify those alignments in the caps inside here as well. And then you can save it, and it would be added to your list here under your stroke options. Here again, we have the gear icon. So you can see here we can copy the stroke details and paste them, kind of like we did with layer styles, where we could copy a layer style and paste it to another layer. And here's another way to get to the more options. In addition, we have the ability to combine shapes or subtract from a shape or intersect shapes. If you've worked with fireworks, you're probably familiar with this. So let me go ahead and show you what subtract front shape does. Let me change my shape here. Let me get an ellipse tool, and I'm going to drag an ellipse inside that shape. So here we can see on my thumbnail of my image, I now have a hole that I've created inside my shape. I can hide my other layers, and you can see we now have transparent there in the middle. And because my stroke and my fill were the same settings that I used when I created my rectangle, my ellipse does have that stroke applied to it. In addition, you can combine shapes, so we could add on to a shape. Let's say we change this. Let's make sure it says combine shapes, and we can change to another shape, and I'm going to drag, and now you'll see I've actually added to the shape. If I click off of that, it'll remove the lines that show the different parts of my shape, but you can see it's become one shape. Let me go back to my rectangle tool. So just as similar that we see in the fireworks application, you can combine your shapes, subtract them, you can intersect, and you can exclude areas, and you can also merge. The next option is setting up your alignments. So when you have multiple shapes selected, you can use this area to align your various shapes either to each other or to the canvas. And when you're working with a variety of shapes, you can also reorder your stacking order of your shapes with this drop-down menu here. And again, we now see the gear icon available on the options panel. So we can change how the shape works. In this case, we have the rectangle tool selected. So right now it's unconstrained, so I can draw a rectangle or a square. Here I can constrain it and it will force me to draw a square. And then I can draw from center, which is a nice feature. When you're drawing from center, when I click and I drag, you can see it's going from the mouse pointer from the inside out, which is sometimes easier to work with, especially if you've already got other things drawn and you're trying to put a shape around another feature. And you can see here I now have a second rectangle layer that's been created when I drew that.